So yeah, thank you all for inviting me to do this. I have really a pretty deep love for Aurora Avenue and for Seattle. I grew up in Des Moines, Washington, down the south end, and but went to the University of Washington and never lived south of the Ship Canal after that. And so I've grown here all my life. Was in real estate development for about 10 years prior to starting working at the City of Shoreline in 2010. So that I was really interested, Tom, in the diagram you displayed, because that's basically the time that I've been working on highway corridors. Obviously, Everett is very similar to Seattle and every other city from the Canadian border down to Mexican border, and that Highway 99 runs all the way. In fact, it runs all the way up to Vancouver and beyond. So, I mean, it's really a common situation that highway corridors are something that every city deals with. And unfortunately, they oftentimes get treated like junior varsity or even freshman teams. They get the leftovers and they get kind of like lack of resources, the whole 9 yards. And I think in Seattle that is especially true the further north you go, until you hit 145th. Shoreline, one of the things that attracted me to start working for Shoreline was the fact that they embraced Aurora as their main street. And that's not that common that a city does that. A lot of times they try to create a kind of town center off that highway. But Shoreline embraced it and said, hey, we've got a 3-mile stretch of Aurora, and the big lift that we're going to do as a young city is we're going to improve the entire stretch. And lots of things were learned during that time. And because I wasn't really there at the initiation at all. That happened really in the mid 2000s, but I started 2010, and so I was there for most of the construction of the 3 miles during the 8 years I was there. And my job really was to make sure that the business community was represented, but also to activate development activity along the route, because that was a big goal of the City of Shoreline, to see investment along the route. So let's talk about it a little bit. I'm going to whip through these slides and then leave room for discussion, but please feel free, Brock, to cut me off if somebody has a question. I won't be monitoring the chat, so if somebody wants to put a question in the chat, feels more comfortable with that, then Brock, you can cut me off. But so let's talk a little bit about the Aurora Corridor project. You're probably all really familiar with it because I'm assuming it's kind of in your backyard, but just some good before and after pictures that Shoreline has. The left it just is so stark. It looks like a big runway, doesn't it? Whereas in the right picture, there's controlled turning, crosswalk designations. We knew that when we touched Aurora, WashDOT codes would basically apply in lots of different ways. And one of the things that WashDOT especially was interested in was controlling turns. And this was a hard thing for businesses because they were used to having maybe 100, 200 feet of curb cut, and they just felt like that was super convenient. And so that was a lot of the pushback, was controlling those turns. And you can see that these medians controlled it. And so, a lot of businesses like this, what was, I don't think as a city person, I was supposed to call a suicide lane, but this suicide lane in the middle, businesses like that because they could customers could turn in from anywhere. Sidewalks Here's a very familiar scene with just kind of the ditch along the side that's thankfully getting replaced mostly, even in North Seattle, where there hasn't been quite as much investment. But that looks all too familiar. This is up by about 192nd. This is one of the first places that saw investment along Aurora, and it continues to see investment along there. I really tried to get a target on that park and ride lot, and that still might happen, but man, that's like the old adage, putting 12 pounds of sand in a 10-pound sack. It just was a little bit hard to do and very expensive. But the sidewalks, landscaping strip, I point out the landscaping strip because a lot of this is safety with obstacles and things like that, but a lot of it is the perception of things, and to walk next to the trees and the landscaping, with the trees and landscaping between you and the traffic, feels so much better from a pedestrian standpoint. And also it gives a visual barrier for the drivers, so they know where the edge is. And so it enhances a little bit more. You know, the 4 or 6 inch curb isn't going to stop a car, but it still feels much more safe when that landscaping strip, as you can see in the distance, is between. We coined an expression, business access transit, or BAT lanes. The point of that was, and you can see the where the Metro bus is heading on the left here of the after picture. That's with the only signs pointing into the businesses. The buses could go up and down without braking, but as a car, as a customer, you could pull it. You could use that lane to pull into the businesses. That was intentional because a lot of pushback from the business community on transit lanes. You know, why are you giving transit lanes? But when you say business access and transit, and then their customers start talking, hey, it's nice to have that lane because you can kind of slow down. You know, you're bombing along and you have kind of almost a deceleration and an acceleration lane in and out of the businesses. That was a positive thing. So that's something else. And this is kind of funny. I just put this in because there really was no before picture here. I don't know where the bikers probably went through neighborhoods, but the interurban trail obviously was improved. We really wanted to keep bikes off of Aurora and away from the buses. And so the interurban trail is a completely separated bikeway, and obviously pedestrian and scooters and all those other things. But this is right north of the Walgreens, right around where the City of Shoreline is planning to make a community center if what I think is happening is still happening. Right as I left there, we kind of were negotiating for a self-storage facility up there at Mr. Vanguard's. That it's got a different name now, but kind of north of City Hall. And so expensive piece of dirt to purchase, but it really well located, and I think that's where they're still going. So that'll connect down from, it runs through Everett and runs all the way to Seattle. So benefits, I don't have the stats beyond mile 1, but I know that safer travel was a big part of the improvement. Immediately, we saw 53% fewer accidents on that mile 1. That was before the other 2 miles were completed. Improved traffic flow, enhanced aesthetics, redevelopment investment, transit speed, environmental improvements, stormwater management, all these things, and very nice pictures. It's one of my favorite pictures of a highway that I've ever seen. So along the way, I got involved with Urban Land Institute. I was involved as a developer, and Urban Land Institute is kind of a think tank of developers and architects and all sorts of different people. But they did nothing in suburbia. And I was, of course, you know, shaking my fist at ULI and saying, why don't you talk about suburban environment, especially about highway corridors, because they're everywhere. And to talk about transit-oriented communities without talking about highway corridors like Highway 99, Aurora, is just telling a part of the picture, because a lot of these people who live on highway corridors think differently than those who live by light rail. Light rail people think in terms of puddles. They hop on. If you live right by a light rail station, you think, okay, how many stops away am I, and what can I walk to within, quarter mile, half mile easily of the light rail. If you live on Aurora with Rapid Ride, or many different things, you think in terms of corridors, and you think in terms of what you can walk to along that stretch. And especially with a Rapid Ride system that has fairly narrow stops, it's really probably a misnomer. It's more frequent ride than rapid ride, because actually getting on the bus, it kind of moves fairly slowly for a BRT system, but it's suited very well for running errands and going to different, going to parks, going to grocery stores, going to a job. I think the current stat is still pretty much the same as it was when Rapid Ride had started. About 30% of the rides are commuters going to work, and 70% are people running errands. So that kind of gives you the idea of what's happening. So it's a very functional bus system, and everybody who rides the bus is a pedestrian by definition. And so that pedestrian world is very important to them. And everything within short distance of those bus stops is strikeable by foot. So anyway, thankfully, ULI wasn't as blind to the issue as I thought they were, because they were working on something right away. The very first thing in 2011 that I was able to participate with was a study of land use around bus rapid transit, sponsored by King County Metro, Shoreline, and Seattle. And that evolved after a grant into a more robust study of how to make healthy corridors. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this, other than just to recommend this for anyone who wants to do a little further reading and research. A lot of really great thinking has come into this, and you'll see that Aurora was one of the case studies used to study healthy corridors. The basic idea is that in most cities, most corridors are unhealthy in one or more of four ways. One is transportation, and I'll let these decks be distributed for everybody, so I'm not going to go through each slide. But transportation is one of the blind spots of these. Economics, the jobs are hard to get to. The density of jobs isn't there. Health and safety, we talked about air quality, but also just traffic safety, and also the access to food is oftentimes very poor along highway corridors. And then equity tends to be very stratified income-wise. The affordability isn't always there, and so on and so forth. So lots of good thoughts been put into that, and I just commend that to you. So finally, I thought I'd just answer a couple kind of questions that I thought people might like to ask. And some of these were kind of teed up by Brock, so thank him for these. But what were the key factors that got the Aurora redevelopment adopted? Like I said, a lack of historic downtown was actually a benefit for Shoreline, because they invested a lot of money in it and resources. Safety was a big concern. Aesthetics. I think just being a young city and their desire to do something big, and the availability of transportation grant funding, they because they were a young city and they really didn't have a credit rating, they pretty much committed to doing this without debt. And so they built as they received grant funding. And so they went off after a lot of federal grants and state grants and shared grants with the transit agencies and different things. And from of the 150, I might get this slightly wrong, but I'm pretty close. I think the overall cost was about 150 million for the 3 miles. And Shoreline taxpayers paid about $12 million of that. And the other 138 million were through all kinds of different, I think they had 50 different grant funding agencies. So really a Herculean effort. I think I've used Herculean twice. That's probably 2 times too many. What was the economic impact after Shoreline's Aurora Avenue redevelopment? Well, I will say property tax is the primary driver. Generally, sales tax was probably secondary. We haven't, I don't know that they've seen a ton of sales tax. I think we still need to see the apple drop at the Shoreline Market, I'm sorry, Central Market and Sears complex to really see that activated, but it will probably come around as we go. But the property tax is really significant. Multifamily, you build 5-6 stories, you're really building more city. You're actually increasing the amount of city. If you build just single story, you're doing nothing. It's just the same as the land. But building multifamily up, it just adds property. And so obviously it's taxed more, and it's also quite high income generating. So the overall tax nut is pretty significant that is invested in. We've seen quite a bit of multifamily, quite a bit of medical office and self-storage. I will say one thing, most single-family homeowners don't embrace multifamily livers that live along a highway corridor. And a lot of times Aurora is the separator of neighborhoods rather than being embraced. And so I was kind of on a soapbox when I was at Shoreline to consider Aurora itself as a neighborhood. I don't think that got anywhere, but whatever. I just think there's something there that you have to think, how do you get these people involved in neighborhood associations? They are significant. But at the time I was in Shoreline, I think we started out with about 600 or 700 residents along Aurora as their front door. And by the time I left, I think we were getting close to 2,000. So, that's a big neighborhood, 2,000 homes, households. That's not people, that's households. So there's probably 4,000 people that think Aurora is their front door. What's getting replaced? The first tier is tired, obsolete, vacant uses, and the second tier is smaller income generators. So, obviously something that's really like fallen down and unoccupied is the first, but the small income generators can include restaurants that are on a big property with lots of parking around them, maybe small strip malls, but the ones that I think people have the most issue with are the ones that are providing low income housing. And a lot of times those single story kind of scrappy World War II era housing projects do provide some really low income housing that's attractive, but it does create a displacement. Did you encounter specific challenges from the businesses along the corridor? Well, yes, we did. Yes, we were sued before the project started by the business owners. And yes, during construction, businesses required a lot of customized treatment. And yes, the length of the construction at their front door, it was pretty hard to avoid it being 6 months right in front of a business. That's about how long it takes to completely rebuild a highway like we did. And that really contributed to a lot of businesses suffering. And, I don't think we could point to any that folded except for the ones that, we bought their property and they decided to move elsewhere, do whatever they wanted with the money. But it definitely caused some suffering. What were some of the most effective ways to get the public support, public engaged? the first mile we tried to do pretty much all in-house at the city, and that was not as effective. In miles 2 and 3, and we obviously messaged from our communications department, so I shouldn't say we didn't do anything in the staff, but we hired Enviro Issues, which was really, really helpful because they're a contract company that just went out and talked to businesses and residents along the corridor. They manned the 24/7 hotline and gave us the things, and then staff would provide technical answers to the more technical questions as follow-up. But a lot of the 24/7 hotline stuff were things that Enviro Issues were empowered to solve, with cones that had been run over or something like that. We had people out there who could address those specific problems for businesses with access. How can citizens best influence the planning process? Practice patience. I would say focus on long-term benefits, but don't minimize short-term negative impacts for businesses. I think if you just focus on long-term projects and say it's all going to be rainbows and unicorns, the businesses will consider you not worth listening to, because you don't understand how business really works. At the same time, if you only focus on the short-term negative impacts, you'll never do anything. So you have to collect data and document facts often. I would encourage you to lobby the city, work with a district representative. Seattle didn't have district council members years past, and so now at least you have somebody in the North End that you can work with. Prioritize your resources, lobby the city to prioritize resources for neglected highway corridors. And I think there's really an equity argument there, as if you have the data and collect that, you could really make a strong case. And I live in Seattle, but I deal with, I'm on the ULI Northwest Product Council, so I'm pretty familiar with the Grand Bargain and how it was really negotiated by a lot of the big players in the downtown core. And it was a really well thought through compromise for that, and it allowed a lot of good things to happen and some funding. However, it pretty much killed development, as I understand it, along the Aurora corridor in Seattle. So I think it just really needs to be considered. Okay, so is there another version of this that we can do in those areas that the rent doesn't immediately support the kind of construction that needs to happen along Aurora. Downtown, you've got so much rent to deal with it. You can throw some extra money at it in different ways, but not in Shoreline, and not in North Seattle, probably north of Green Lake. So which stakeholders were most supportive of the Aurora redesign project in Shoreline? Obviously, the most supportive are those who believe in growth management, and that's like the Urban Land Institute and that kind of group. Long-range planners, WSDOT, and transit agencies were very, very supportive. Second, those who benefit financially, and there's certainly the real estate development that you can call on, like NIOP, the brokers and so forth, that understand how investment like this will pay off in the long run. And I would say that most property owners understand that. Unfortunately, most property owners are fairly quiet. It's the few that are loud that you'll probably have to deal with more often. So just be aware that opposition will probably use the same tactics that we have seen in the political landscape for a long time, that facts and data and so forth will not necessarily be accepted, even if it's well done. So you have to have a real kind of just strong foothold on the facts. Well, I guess that's my last slide. So happy to, I'm going to go up to the benefits slide
Yeah,
just because I think that's such a pretty one.
that's a good one. Yeah, there's a few questions in the chat, and I kind of, instead of me talking to you, I think it'd be better if I just called on them. There's just a couple here, and then
Great.
maybe others will jump in. So why don't we start with Robin, who had a question around displacement.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit worried, you know, things that are happening down in Rainier and all sorts of neighborhoods deal with displacement of ongoing businesses. How do we determine or how do we control rent or I don't know, how do we develop for the better without displacing people who are there and have ongoing businesses?
Well, if I act at all in this answer like I know the answer to this, then shoot me, because I think this is really a thorny issue.
It is.
And it is one that I've been thinking about quite a lot too, because in Everett, as you know, Casino Road is, if you may not know, but Casino Road is an area of quite a bit of density, quite a bit of multifamily housing, and quite a bit of poverty. And we have a light rail station coming at both ends of it. There's going to be 2 light rail stations about 3 miles apart with Casino Road connecting them. And if there was ever a situation where displacement is going to happen, it's going to be along Casino Road and Everett. So we've been thinking about it. And I will say, what if you focus on individuals and say we are going to prevent them from being displaced, that's maybe a harder solution than talking about housing units that are a particular income level. So I think what we're planning to do, at least initially, is try to count of, let's just say there's 1,000 housing units and 200 of them are serving people with incomes at 30% of the adjusted median income for the county. Our goal is to keep 200 housing units at that 30% AMI. It's not necessarily to keep all those residents, because the light rail will be built out over many years, and it will be difficult. So how do you keep those 30%? Well, I think you need to really have engagement with the affordable housing providers that strategically purchase properties that they will long-term hold on to maintain the rents at the certain levels. I don't think we can expect the private property owners, developers to add at that level. The private developers will add at maybe the 60 to 80% AMI, which is more the workforce, and they can, with the multifamily property tax exemption, you can add that, but those aren't the ones that are really the hard ones. The hard ones are the 50% below. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but that would be, I think there's really a strategy of strategic purchases. We have a lot of our housing people who provide affordable housing won't buy along Casino because it already has so much poverty, and they want to buy in parts of the cities where they can spread. So that's a policy issue that we have to kind of work with them on. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful. I think it's a very, very thorny problem.
Dan, I think it's thorny, but one of the things I was thinking of was businesses specifically. A lot of them are car oriented, and as we move towards people living on Aurora, what happened up in Shoreline?
As far as the car dealers?
As far as car oriented, how did the businesses change? And was it obviously for the better, but what happened to all those businesses that were going on in Shoreline?
Well, a lot of them survived and have thrived. Aurora Rent's one that they got knocked down. They built a brand new building, back up, but those were established. A lot of the car dealers are still there. There definitely have been, displacement, but there's like everywhere along Aurora, except for like at 125th, where you've got these big, huge lots. There's a lot of small kind of 1 acre lots. And so there's probably 100 stories to that. We had some restaurants, single restaurants get torn down, and we had big developments go up. But, there really hasn't been a whole lot of if you just listed off the businesses, you always have some churn. And my guess is there hasn't been that much more churn than you would expect on a highway corridor that was unimproved. I think we just have seen more investment and more multifamily than you would expect, and more multi-story development. We didn't get the 1-story doctor office. We got the 3-story doctor office, and so on and so forth, because of the investment that people saw in it. And, I don't think everything's going to be structured parking. You'd probably get, like doctor office, for example, you get a 3-story, but it has surface parking. And so it's kind of a hybrid along a highway corridor.